What advice do you have for your early stage entrepreneurs who are about to launch a product that you've invested in? What are the kind of key things that you would say to them as they're about to kind of launch out into the world?
A few things. Number one is you need key performance indicators. You need some type of metrics to track. I highly recommend having some weekly metric, whether that's weekly active uniques. For instance, I'm using the language of a web-based product. I would also look at conversion from browser to buyer or browser to user from your primary traffic sources, and look at that very carefully. If you're using Google Analytics, look at your top 50 traffic sources at least once a week, because you will identify in some cases links that come in from thought leaders who are not necessarily traffic leaders, and those are the people you want to connect with. Lastly, I would say ensure you're looking at actionable metrics and not vanity metrics, like page views in some cases, which can be gamed very easily or misleading. Actually, that was second to last. Lastly, if it's web-based, again, I'm making an assumption, I would encourage you to look at something called the Net Promoter Score, which gets real customer feedback and allows you to make certain tweaks. And when in doubt, if you're trying to guess at what's wrong and what's right, pay 5 people a few quid to come on in and sit in front of a computer and just watch them, have them go through your site to do something and just watch their behavior. That's the cheapest way to do it. Yeah, there you go.
My question is, I have a few questions actually. So first one is, how does your typical week or month looks like these days after you finish your third book? Like how much you still travel, how much you're still learning new things? And in relation to that, like what's your sort of driving force? Like why do you do all these things? Like what's your motivation behind all these things? How do you give yourself so much passion to keep doing these things? And finally, like after you achieve the sort of your body recomposition goal, in your case, do you still follow the slow carb diet?
My key driver is fear of death and wanting to get a lot done before I'm gone. I mean, it sounds really morbid. Not really fear of death, just recognition. I've had a number of really good friends pass away in the last year or two, some by natural, some by unnatural causes, and I'm not done. So I want to use the highest leverage tools I have to impart some really simple principles that I think make a big difference. That's the driver. I'm still following a slow carb diet, and yes, you can follow it when you're in the UK. Yes, you can follow it if you're Asian and you eat a lot of rice. Yes, you can follow it just about anywhere. So I had that question today, that's why I bring it up. I know it seems like a non sequitur, but yeah, you can follow that just about anywhere. So I'm still following that, but I do have my cheat day. In terms of my average week, I don't really have much of an average week, but right now during book launch, which I'm still in for the next month, I tend to batch very similar activities best I can. It's all right, I like the soundtrack. So I have 1 or 2 weeks of very compressed media interviews and things like that, engagements of this type, and then I'm gone. I'm going to disappear for a few weeks and focus on learning a new language and surfing. And it's important to realize that 4-hour work week shouldn't be taken entirely literally, although it can be, and it has been, and it can be certainly put into practice. But it's about having maximal per hour output. And whether you choose to use the same number of hours or fewer is up to you. In my particular case, my preference is not to equally distribute work in every week. I prefer to sprint really hard for a period of time and then just disappear completely for a period of time. I'm very binary. I like on or off. I'm not sure if I missed any questions, but I'll have to do that for now.
The third question was really, why do you keep following the slow carb diet after you achieve the body recomposition? Do you kind of come back to your old...
Why do I keep following? I keep following a slow carb diet because I think it avoids a lot of autoimmune problems. And yeah, I think, and endocrine problems. I think it's a very healthy diet for long term, whether it's lifespan or just general avoiding neurodegenerative disease in some cases also. So that's why. Yeah.
You mentioned surfing a bit earlier on, and as I understand, you're learning from a great master over the internet how to surf. How do you recommend attracting great mentors into your life?
All right, so the question was, how do I suggest attracting mentors into my life? And with surfing, for instance, I ended up learning how to do a pop-up from a guy named Brad Gerlach, who was formerly #1 ranked surfer in the world. And I did it via Skype video. I was actually in an apartment in Berlin when it was raining, and he was in Los Angeles, and we did it remotely. The fastest answer is you pay them. honestly, for like Brad, you could do it very, very, very affordably. That's the path of least resistance. There's a question of how to find them, and then there's a question of how to engage with them. Those are two different things. In terms of how to find them, I'm going to have to defer, just in the interest of time, to the deconstruction section in the 4-Hour Chef, where I talk about how to track them down on Google and different questions I use. In terms of how to engage, you can certainly just pay them. Secondly is to freelance write a piece and interview them as part of that piece. And then tack on an extra 5 or 10 minutes to ask you what you'd like to ask them. Would be my recommendation. But if budget allows, the most direct way is just to pay them for $50, $100, $200 for a Skype session.
Very interesting. Thank you very much.
Yeah, my pleasure.
Hi, Tim. It's believed that 90% of new businesses fail in their first year, and of those that survive, only another 90% of those fail in their second year. Is that something that you've seen with your experience of working with startups? And if it is, what advice would you give to somebody who is looking to start up now facing those figures?
Here's my take on that, is that those businesses fail for the most part because the people who are starting them either should not be starting them or they just didn't plan them properly. I do think that if you follow, for instance, if we're talking about tech, if you follow more of a lean startup approach, and I've done quite a lot with Eric Ries, and you, for instance, market validate before developing your product, and use testing very rigorously, I think the cost of failure is so low at this point in time that you can afford to test 5, 10 different models, especially if you're using, let's say, Amazon Web Services. So I think that the key should be, first, ensure that you have a market that is large enough and that is willing to purchase your product before you put a lot of time into product development. And you can do that by designing advertisements beforehand, for instance, and then having people sign up for information when they click purchase. Real easy. There are regulations that apply to what's called dry testing, which that is, so you have to check that. Test fast and test cheap would be my advice, though. If you do that, it's very rare that, number one, you'll fail ultimately if you have a good head on your shoulders, and secondly, if you do fail, the cost will be so low that you can try multiple times. So.
Just really quickly, what do you think about business school for entrepreneurship and everything else in life in general, really?
Business school?
Yeah.
I have some rather strong opinions about business school. Unlike all of my other opinions, I'm so subdued otherwise. I think that if the business schools we're talking about are anything like the business schools in the United States, even the top business schools, I fantasized about going to Stanford Business School quite a lot. I actually went almost through the entire application process twice. And the reason I didn't do it is because I determined it was not practical and not helpful for entrepreneurs. End of story. I believe that it is extremely helpful if you're in a profession like investment banking or management consulting, where they need that stamp on the CV to charge an extra $200 an hour for your services. And there are certain things that it will teach you that allow you to function much more effectively within larger organizations. But if you're going to start your own company, I would take that amount of money that you would, for instance, at Stanford. I don't know what it's like here, but Stanford is 120 grand minimum, last I checked, for 2 years. What I decided to do instead was say, all right, I could spend it on that, or I could take $120,000, this is exactly what I did, and allocate it to startup investing over the next 2 years. And even if I lose all of that money, I'm going to view it as my business school tuition. That's how I got started in angel investing. So I do have a pretty strong opinion, but it's not an unusual opinion among the people who are entrepreneurs that I most respect. But will it hurt you? Is it a great way to take a 2-year vacation and play a lot of beer pong and not feel too guilty about it? And not have an empty space on your CV? I'm not kidding. It's nothing wrong with that if you want to do it. But I don't think it's going to give you very practical training for being an in-the-trenches entrepreneur who has to really fight full contact. Doesn't mean you can't sit in on some really good classes, especially if they're taught by very successful venture capitalists and deal makers. So if you can sit in on those, go for it.
Hi, I'm just interested to know, as you were writing the 4-Hour Workweek, if you had any inkling as to how successful it would be, and what it was about the book, and if not, in hindsight, what it is about the book that you didn't know then as to why it's successful.
I had no idea the 4-Hour Workweek was going to be as successful as it was, not remotely. It was a small book in terms of advance and what the publisher was going to put behind it. And as with any startup, which writing a book and publishing a book can certainly be considered a startup in a lot of ways, there's so many factors outside of your control. I had to assume from the outset that I could be comfortable with the worst case scenario. I think it's very important to be psychologically prepared for the worst and hope for the best, as opposed to being blindlessly optimistic. I think optimism is actually very overrated. Sorry, I'm like reminiscing on this. I decided when I was writing most of the book in Buenos Aires, Argentina, that I would be happy if it sold to even 10 people, even 2 people, and it really fundamentally changed their lives. And so I wrote the book. I threw out my first 2 drafts of the beginning of the book because it wasn't the right tone and it just wasn't me. And then I decided to write it as if I'd had 2 glasses of wine, which I probably did also, and then wrote to 2 of my best friends. And one of them was an entrepreneur who was stuck in his own company, was sick and tired of it and didn't know how to get himself out of it. And the other was an investment banker who hated life, but his lifestyle had bloated to match his income, and he didn't know what to do. So I basically wrote the entire book as if I was talking to the 2 of them, and I was like, worst case scenario, I can just give the book to these 2 guys. And it turned out that apparently, that tone struck a chord, but why did it work? If I had to point to the more mechanical aspect of how I got the word out, it's because I focused on single author blogs that were considered thought leaders in a few key verticals, and I knew exactly who my first target market was, which was my demographic. Don't speculate. Don't assume you know people who are unlike yourself extremely well if you can sell to people who are exactly like yourself. Does that make sense? So my target right off the bat was 20 to 35-year-old tech-savvy males in San Francisco and New York. That was it. Didn't mean that's my market, but you have to have a clear target, and then it can radiate out from there like a ripple effect. So I'd say those are a few things. And I met those influencers in person. Email, most crowded channel. Phone, they hate phone. Don't do that. So I actually took my budget, so to speak, which was not large, and I spent it all on flying to conferences and buying bloggers drinks and food and whatnot. And just hanging out and asking a lot of questions. I didn't hard pitch anyone. Just asked a lot of questions, and then if they asked a lot of questions of me and found my story in whatever fashion interesting, then I would offer to send them a free book and highlight, tab 20 pages they might find interesting. That was it.
Hi, thank you so much for coming. I saw your post this week about your trip to Alaska, and as an Alaskan myself, I was really interested in why you chose to go there, and if you could share a funny moment or 2 of your adventure.
All right, funny story from Alaska. Oh yes, absolutely. For those of you who haven't seen my latest blog post, the latest blog post was about a trip I took to a very remote part of Alaska, about 5 or 6 hours flight time north of Fairbanks, which is pretty damn remote. It's north of the Arctic Circle, about 30 kilometers from the most remote point in North America. And I was dropped off with a few people on the edge of a lake bank in a seaplane with a satellite phone, and we were left there for 5 to 6 days for a caribou hunt. And I've never been a hunter, but I became very good friends with a gentleman named Steve Rinella, who's an incredible writer, very smart guy, and has hunted since he was a child. And he took me on this hunt. So he chose Alaska, the Brooks Range, and the caribou migration. So there are roughly 400,000 or so caribou in this migration. So we were dropped off, and we were going to hunt caribou, fish, and forage blueberries and whatnot for food for this period of time. Funny instances. I'd say the funniest, in a way, was when we had 3 different grizzlies come into our camp. And at one point, we had a large adult male grizzly just galloping towards our camp, literally maybe 200 meters away. And the camera guys are freaking out. I'm just kind of paralyzed, bear, guys, bear. And we had guns, but it's you could shoot. If you haven't seen an adult grizzly bear in the flesh, it's a freaking humongous animal. And their skulls are this thick. So it's you shoot it with a shotgun on a glancing blow, it's just going to take you out like a freight train. They're really formidable animals. And Steve, because everyone's like, Steve, expert hunter guy, by the way, and he went into his tent to get something, and he found out that his cell phone was at the bottom of his bag and had been destroyed by insect repellent that had pooled at the bottom, and he was like, God damn it, God, my phone is broken, I can't believe this. And he was bitching and moaning and fuming and storming around about his cell phone for like 2 minutes. This bear's just round and coming, and everyone's like, Steve, Steve, Steve. And he's like, all right. And he took the shotgun and like shot it in the air and started chasing this bear and waving at it and scared it off. And I was just like, okay, I guess that's how you do it. Thanks, Steve. And then we went to bed that night, and it stayed light almost the entire time. It was sort of this like 5 p.m. type of dusk light the entire time. And it was flat. It's called, that type of grizzly is a barren ground grizzly. Apparently they're pretty tasty because they eat blueberries. Bear, not always so tasty. And so you would see these things moving around in the distance, and it's like, caribou or bear, who knows? Like, we have to wait and find out. And so when we went to bed, it was kind of like, all right, guys, hope you're not dead in the morning. Bye. And then we'd sleep with like a gun and bear spray, and it was, pray that we weren't dead. So that was unique. I'm not used to having like potential man-eaters in San Francisco. I would love to go back though. I mean, honestly, being completely disconnected for 5 days with no phones, no calendars, no laptops, no magazines, no news, no nothing. It was like a 6-month vacation. So amazing. I recommend everyone check out Alaska. When people say, oh, it's vast, I'm like, can you please be a little more descriptive? That doesn't help me. And it is, there's nothing like it. It's incredible. So.
Hi, Tim. I was just wondering, did your two friends read the book that you mentioned earlier?
Yeah, they did.
Yeah, they changed.
They did both read the book. And one of them changed companies, so he shifted to the same banking job because that was his skill set, but he was actually able to reclaim some of his life. And the other completely restructured his business so that he can take off for months at a time now. Yeah.
And then I was just wondering, how do you stop doing what you should and disappear into Alaska for 6 days or take up ballroom dancing? How do you stop, going to boring work?
This is a really good question. This is perhaps the most challenging aspect of all of this. Right? I can provide tactics. I can provide things that make one more productive or make myself more productive. But how do you turn off and say no is a big issue. And I think that I've tried to train myself as best I can by, in part, reading a lot of Stoic philosophy, specifically Seneca the Younger. So Letters from a Stoic. I find it a little more readable and actionable than, say, Marcus Aurelius. Lastly is recognizing that in a world where people expect immediate responses, oftentimes, and increasingly so, you have to, I believe, let small bad things happen constantly to have any agenda of your own and to get the big positive things done. So it's recognizing that to prevent all hurt feelings, all mistakes, all problems, all of this is impossible. And if you try to do that, you will never have a proactive schedule of your own is extremely important. So effectively just saying, I'm going to accept the collateral damage and believe that what I'm embarking upon is worth more than those minor or reversible problems, and then forging ahead. That's it. You got to take a few flesh wounds.
You mentioned just like 10 minutes or 15 minutes ago that you had an existential crisis that then led to your book. So I would be interested to know about that more, and to hear something that actually didn't work in your life.
Let's see. So the existential crisis, I have one of those like every 6 or 12 months. But this particular one was quite serious. This was in mid-2004, and I had a long-term girlfriend leave me, and I was pretty sure we were on the road to a real long-term partnership because of my schedule. And I felt trapped by my startup, and I decided that I would actually come here. I came to London, wherever we are right now. Came to London for ostensibly 4 weeks to either completely redesign my company so I could leave it and have it run on its own, or to shut it down. And that 4 weeks then turned into 18 months of travel. But the existential crisis was feeling trapped and not feeling as though I could say no or shut something down. I felt like I had a lot of sunk cost. Does that make sense? So I had invested so much into it, I couldn't stop, and which is exactly what my two friends felt. And I think that's also an ongoing battle. So for instance, a few things that haven't worked. Let's see. Well, not to talk about a hugely sensitive subject, but there are aspects of this last launch that haven't worked, for instance, right, with this book. And I constantly want to push myself outside of my comfort zone. So this was a grand experiment. It was the first major book out of Amazon Publishing. and I decided to partner with a technology company, reinventing publishing as opposed to a publishing company adopting technology, which I think has been a fascinating journey, and I don't regret the decision at all. But in the US, for instance, I mean, that's led to massive boycotting by competitors like Barnes & Noble. That's been really painful, really painful. I mean, I've had so many moments of doubt, and it's been extremely difficult. But I don't regret having done it. There are lots of things that haven't worked, tons. Yeah, way too many to list. But I think partially the reason that I don't talk about them more, although I'm certainly willing to talk about them, is through competitive sports. I learned to view failure as feedback, because all you do in sports is fail, even at the highest level. Like if you're training with people, they have to be better than you, or you don't get any better. And I think people can inoculate themselves in the same way, whether it's by mock negotiation and debate, or through sports. So those are some of my thoughts.